welcome to another episode of Raising the Bar with myself, John Cooper. And today we have a very special guest. We have Iain McGilchrist. Iain is a psychiatrist, author and former Oxford military scholar. Iain initially read English at New College, Oxford, but retrained in medicine and has been a neuroimaging researcher at the Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore and is a consultant psychiatrist at the Maudsley Hospital in South London. Iain came to prominence with his latest book. So, Iain, how about I let you take the floor and just lead us into the book that we're going to be talking about in today's show and lay out its core themes.
I mean, the book is called The Master and His Emissary, The Divided Brain and the Making of the Western World. And the idea of the Master and his Emissary is really to cut as short as I can so that we can move on to other things. It's the idea of a wise spiritual master who looks after a community very well so that it flourishes. As it grows and flourishes, he realizes that he can't do everything for it, but what's more important is his insight that he mustn't get involved with certain things if he's to maintain his all-important overview. And so he delegates a lot of work of a more routine kind to be done by a very efficient administrator, effectively. Unfortunately, this bright administrator is not quite bright enough to know what it is he doesn't know, and so thinks he knows everything. And because, of course, he doesn't understand everything, when he tries to make out that he's the master and he can sort everything out, everything goes very badly wrong. It's very much like the story of The Sorcerer's Apprentice, if
yes,
listeners know that story, which in fact was based on a poem by Goethe, who was very exercised by this phenomenon himself, though he wouldn't have obviously recognized that it had anything to do with the structure of the brain. But that's the idea of that. And in the first part of the book, I deal with the neurology and neuropsychology and philosophy. And in the second part of the book, I really go through the history of the West from the ancient Greeks to the present day, asking the question, at this point in history, was there a better balance? And what I find is that when there is a better balance, society flourishes, the arts flourish, science moves forward. When there isn't a good balance, everything fossilizes, stultifies, and we lose the vitality and the imagination that a society needs.
So would you say that society goes through pendulum shifts from one hemisphere, if you like, to the other? And is that done as a way in sort of spiral dynamics they talk about transcending and including? So you go into one, you saturate one part, and then you move into the other one, you saturate that part, and then it all gets lifted and integrated as one. Would you say that's what's happening, or would you say that there's times in history where you've actually had, because you talk a lot about the asymmetry of the hemisphere, but is there ever a time in history where there's actually not a symmetry, but the two complementing each other at exactly the same historical time, periodic time?
Well, yes, I would say, as I've mentioned, there were probably three periods that I'd put around the 6th, 5th century BC in Greece, around the year dot in Rome, and then again from about 1400 and something up to about 1600 and something, when we had a very good balance, but that since the Enlightenment we've rather lost it. I like the idea of the spiral dynamics, which is also another way of talking about a dialectical movement in which one thing is not just opposed to something else, but needs to be balanced with it and included and taken up to another level. That's very important dynamic for me. I believe in it philosophically and historically as the best way to understand what's happening. The only thing is that there is an important difference between the hemispheres about everything, and that includes about their own relationship. So while the right hemisphere realizes that what is needed is a both and, it doesn't, after all, in the story, it was the master who appointed his emissary. So he knows he needs an emissary. The right hemisphere realizes the left hemisphere can contribute. But unfortunately, the left hemisphere doesn't realize that the right hemisphere can contribute. It tends to be exclusive, either or. And because of the rather narrow means it uses to determine whether something is right, if it computes in a computer-like way, according to the left hemisphere, that's all right because my theory says this is how things should be. Um, that picture is not where we should be stopping. And in other words, that should be taken back. That piece of useful work, that piece of analysis, of rational assessment or rationalistic assessment needs to be taken back into the whole picture that the right hemisphere alone can offer. And what I'm suggesting is, at the moment, this natural dynamic you talk about, the spiral dynamic, is being frustrated because there isn't really this synthesis going on which we need.
Is the right brain, the characteristics of the right brain, is this, would you say that children have this at a very early age? Because when we're young, we're often very flexible, very sponge-like. We absorb a lot of information, but we're very playful. The way that we see the world is in terms of relationships. That it takes them a while to actually discriminate between objects. They see things as a pool of potential more. And then actually, as they grow older, they tend to move, you would say, more into the left brain and start to learn what separation is, more about objects. It becomes more about particles rather than possibility. Is this a skill that we once had as children and we've somehow lost this skill, or is this just a natural evolution of the brain that we go through this process?
Well, it's a very good question. I mean, first of all, in terms of the preponderance of each hemisphere, you're quite right that in the first 2.5 years of life, the right hemisphere seems to be more important. And then the left hemisphere has a sort of spurt, if you like, not literally a growth spurt, but it becomes more preponderant as we acquire language, really. And then there's another flip towards the right hemisphere at around the age of 5 or 6, and gradually things sort of settle down. I'm afraid in the normal adult, there's a sort of, if you do an EEG of most people under most circumstances, there's a small preponderance, about 1.2 to 1 of left hemisphere activity to right, but we can train our brains to do that differently. I don't think it's that we've lost it. I mean, I think our civilization is helping us ignore it. So Western civilization, particularly over the last 200 years, has tended so much to prioritize a certain way of thinking about the world that, as I suggest in the book, we're at danger of losing all the things that our right hemisphere could teach us and could enable us to understand and to be, because of the preponderance of this particular way of thinking about the world, which is markedly skewed towards, as it were, the take of the left hemisphere.
I was on a plane and I met I had the fortune of sitting next to a neuroscientist on the plane. And
Right.
we actually, this was a few years ago, and we were actually talking about the left and right brain. And he actually said to me in his work that he said that chronic left brain imbalance has been suggested that could actually lead to a kind of a rerouting into the R complex. And so he says that if you're, and as he says, a lot of sometimes psychopaths are very kind of well spoken and they're very precise and very in their language, and it can actually, it's been known that it can, chronic left brain imbalance can, like the executive command can get shunted to the R complex, which is all about fear and survival and control effectively.
Well, it's certainly true that psychopaths have defective right hemisphere function. They're a very clear example. Yeah. Which is why they find it impossible to empathize, and why, in fact, they don't understand actually morality. They think that morality is all a matter of calculation. Funnily enough, a lot of philosophy departments are also thriving on the idea that morality is really just a matter of calculation, which is fascinating, because that point of view is normally held by people who have right hemisphere brain damage, are autistic or are psychopathic. So it's an interesting state of affairs we've got ourselves into.
Yeah, because you talk about how the left brain leads to control, but is that the left hemisphere in isolation, or is that the left hemisphere sort of activating other parts of the brain, such as the amygdala or the reptilian complex, or is or do we just leave it as just the left hemisphere that's creating that control?
Well, of course, whenever anything's happening, of course, there is an amygdala in each of the left and the right hemisphere and so forth.
Yeah.
We could get into, and in the book I tend to do that more, get into detail about exactly which areas are involved. But I'm really interested foremost in characterizing the very extensive system of each hemisphere, because what we now realize is a couple of things. One is that whereas we used to think of things very much in terms just of little modules, we now see that almost everything we do depends on very widely distributed networks. And that things that activate parts of the frontal lobes, if they're important, will probably also be taking into action with them the temporal lobes and the occipital lobes and parietal lobes. So the whole of a hemisphere is often acting, and that the second thing is that each hemisphere is massively more intra-connected with, amongst itself than it is interconnected with the other hemisphere. So when you're looking at networks, very often you must take into account a larger network in a hemisphere as a whole. And indeed, one of the fascinating things, one of the things that got me going on this, is the extraordinary thing I remember learning when I was studying neurophysiology, that the function of the corpus callosum, the band of fibers that principally connects the two hemispheres, is very largely inhibitory. I mean, this is extraordinary. So there is something very important about the two hemispheres being able to operate separately. But they also need to cooperate. And this is something people find difficult to get a hold on, but the easiest way to put it is, you know, in a surgical team, you need a surgeon and you need a scrub nurse as a minimum. And it doesn't help if the scrub nurse tries to make the incision and the surgeon does the job of the scrub nurse. They cooperate, but they cooperate by having quite different tasks.
Absolutely. It's like one takes the front seat and one takes the back seat, so it's working in that complementary, that function. And it's actually interesting. I don't know if you've heard of a guy called Charles Lim, but he did a TEDx talk, and it's called "Your Brain on Improv." And what he did is
I haven't seen that.
Oh, you must check that out. It's really interesting. He gets a guy a jazz player called Keith Jarrett, and he puts him through.
I know Keith Jarrett. Yes, yes.
Okay, yeah. He puts him through. I think it's him. He puts him through an MRI, and they look at the I think it's called bold imaging, where they're like looking at like the blood flows in certain areas of the brain, and they said that when he was improvising, I've written this down because I need to, there was a medial prefrontal activation, and that responded.
That's right.
That was like the self-expression. But what happened was at exactly the same time there was a deactivation in the lateral prefrontal. Because one had to activate and one had to deactivate in order for it to come into being. And that's pretty much what you're saying. There has to be this sort of allowing for the other to take the back seat so the other one can.
That's right. I mean, in order for one to be able to improvise, there has to be a degree of order, but a degree of something erupting out of it that isn't being over-controlled. And that involves balances between different areas in hemispheres and different hemispheres between one another and so forth. But everything we do is, if you like, it's required that there should be opposing forces that balance one another. Coming back to the idea of a dialectic, that we need the constraint and the freedom together. We need control and abandonment together. We need love and we need discipline together. Whatever it is in life, we need these opposites. And what I'm really saying is that we've got into a very single-minded way of thinking.
Yeah,
and that's something that in. Go on.
Yeah, so I was going to say it's like we need that positive. We need the positive poles to work together. I know you don't like using the terms masculine and feminine. You try and steer away from that, and I can I see that. But in terms of nature, there's a feminine and a masculine element. Transmission being masculine, reception being feminine. And we see that in plants, we see that in sex, we see how the seed is laid, and then there's a conception. We even see in conversation, like, someone makes a point, and then someone will receive the point. It's almost like we need that kind of masculine and feminine receiving and transmitting in nature.
Yes, I mean, my reluctance has nothing to do with my supposedly believing that there aren't differences. And there's a vast literature on psychological difference between men and women. Of course, I mean, if it's true that our minds and our bodies are not separate from one another, and it clearly is the case that they're not wholly distinct from one another and influence one another very much. Since the bodies are different, the minds are going to be as well. So that's not my reluctance. My reluctance is when people want to label one or other of the hemispheres as male or female. And the awkward thing is that although I understand what people are getting at when they say, oh, well, the right hemisphere seems to be more female and so on, is that all the actual anatomy, neuroendocrine, neurophysiological evidence is that it's more the other way around. You know, it's testosterone that causes the right hemisphere to expand in utero in males, and it's in males that the right hemisphere is a little bigger than the left. In females, they're the same size. And when it comes to function, it's a very similar thing. I mean, and there are about 40 different findings. I'm not going to go into them all now, but they almost all point in the direction of a connection between the right hemisphere and maleness and the left hemisphere and femaleness, which is very interesting because it's not what people think.
It's not. I mean, like the pop culture on that would be the standard left hemisphere being masculine, right hemisphere being feminine. There is.
Well, if you think about the neuropsychology, you know, just taking the two most well-established and long-established differences that probably everyone will accept, is that women tend to be more verbal. I mean, obviously there are huge exceptions. Every individual's different, but women tend to be more verbal, and men tend to be better at visuospatial manipulations, seeing things from different angles, rotating things, and so on. You know, the verbal thing is just more left hemisphere based, and the visuospatial rotation is very much more right hemisphere based. So you've got it right there, if you like.
I mean, I even wrote a book, and I referred to the left and right hemisphere, and I wish I wish your book had come out sooner, you know, because I was. But there's a few things that I did put in there which I do think actually hold a truth to still, and that is you tell me how far away I was from the truth when I wrote this in my book. I said that the coming from just solely the left brain dominance, let's say, it likes to discriminate in terms of breaking things down into parts, such as opening a bonnet of a car and looking at everything in terms of like each individual parts. But it doesn't see the relationships, the interconnected relationships that occur within all those objects, from like the tapestry of the whole, rather than it just likes to see the how would you say, the pixels on the screen, but not the image of the screen, effectively. And coming from that place of left brain, sort of motivated by the left brain, it disconnects us in terms of our humanity with each other and our relationships, because it objectifies everyone, and it sees that there's distance and separation between us all. And I was talking about moving it more. Actually, funny enough, I refer to it as moving us more into the right hemisphere, because by doing so, we're able to appreciate the relationships that are omnipresent.
In terms of, I mean, the most robust thing I think you said was that the left hemisphere tends to be focused on detail, and the right hemisphere sees the big picture. And interestingly, this is also one of the things that comes out of the neuropsychological literature about differences between men and women, is that women tend to remember details of things. If, for example, told a story, they will often recount details, whereas men will recount the overall scope of the plot more often. I mean, again, these are gross generalizations, but also if you ask girls and boys to copy a picture, girls will often copy a number of rather detailed elements, but the boys will tend to do a less detailed picture, but with more of the overall shape. Which is just is interesting. Again, if people are trying to nail down one or the other as being male or female.
That actually might link into the fact, if you've ever had to give a police report of an alleged criminal or something like that. I've had to do this in the past, and I've been confronted by this person for a minute or two, and then when they've asked me what he looks like, I've got absolutely no idea. And I think this is a phenomenon that we all have, in that when they ask us any tattoos, any glasses, how short his hair was, what colour his clothes were, I had absolutely no idea. And I think it's because I was actually activating another part of my brain, which is all about taking this person in terms of, am I safe? How am I reading this person? It's almost like I'm using a different part of my awareness. The detail.
No, I think that's very reasonable.
And I think that's probably because maybe would you say that we default to the right brain when we meet people? And I think Malcolm Gladwell calls it thin slicing people, when you sort of take them all in.
Well, yes. I mean, again, all these things are complex, and we use all kinds of things in different circumstances. But I think as a very broad generalization, it's true that when there is a difficult situation or a new situation, in either of those things obtaining, we would be generally defaulting to the right hemisphere to help us understand it. And we'd have to make an issue out of remembering a detail, because we would be very much taking in a whole lot of things that are largely subliminal, that are giving us an idea of what's going on here, and what's the intention, and we can detect tiny changes in somebody's eyes that last for only a few hundredths of a second. And that's very much the right hemisphere that is able to do that. If asked to verbalize later, I mean, we make something up. That good old left hemisphere, so I don't know, I'll make something up, which tends to be, it's called confabulating. It doesn't really know, so it makes something up, which is why a lot of reports after events are not right. No. Because quite famously, witness reports are not right, because often they're thinking that they're confabulating, because they're thinking. I had an interesting case of, I live here next to a farm, and somebody who's come to live here came up to visit just before coming, and met the farmer, and he was quite convinced that this farmer was on a tractor and wearing a tweed jacket and a cloth cap, because that was his image of a farmer. And when he came later and he's asked about the farmer, he said, "Where is he?" And I said, "Well, first of all, the farmer doesn't have a tractor. Secondly, I've never seen him wear a cloth cap or a tweed jacket." And and he was just amazed, because he was completely convinced you'd seen it. In other words, he confabulated it.
Confabulate. I read that. I was reading that in your book, confabulate. It's a great word. It will put dots in there to connect something that doesn't actually exist, just to create some kind of lineal.
Yeah, and this is very much a left hemisphere to right hemisphere, the difference. And right hemisphere, even if it thinks it knows something pretty well and does, will be more tentative about it. The left hemisphere is absolutely nothing loath in making something up that fits the story. And it's not that it's doing it deliberately, it's actually believing its own
lies.
Yes.
That's really interesting. And also, in terms of schooling, I mean, it does seem as though they're teaching you what to think and not how to think, which is also what you refer to in the book as the difference between the two hemispheres as well. Remembering data, recalling data. Would you say that's more of a left brain thing? And the right brain should be more about intelligence, where it can actually work out patterns and actually understand, how to think, and independent thinking.
Yes.
But we're rewarded for repetition, regurgitation.
Absolutely, which is not an education. An education is teaching you to be critical, to think differently, flexibly, to adopt different points of view and see how they work, to take, in fact, the inverse of the point of view you believe to be definitely right and see whether there's some truth in it. And all that is how people require to be educated, inspired, and made to be alive, whereas actually just receiving passively a lot of data is not an education. A couple of things you mentioned there, pattern recognition and intelligence. Both of them, interestingly, are more right hemisphere based. People think, well, the right hemisphere may be interesting in a sort of touchy-feely kind of a way, because it has this outdated image as being, kind of new agey or something. But actually, good old-fashioned cognitive intelligence as measured by IQ is very preponderantly dependent on the right hemisphere.
Yes.
So, for example, a study 5 years ago now looked at, I think, 128 people who'd had brain injuries or strokes, and looked at what the effect on their IQ had been. And what they found was that almost all the parts that were injured, where people had a sharp drop in IQ, were in the right hemisphere, not in the left. So, I mean, all that is fascinating. There's a lot more about all of this in the new book I'm writing, or have almost finished writing. I've finished the 30 substantive chapters, and I'm trying to write the epilogue almost as we speak. So.
Oh, fantastic! Oh, wonderful. There's so much more. I guess it's just an infinite amount of commentary you can make on it, on the subjects, I guess. I wanted to.
I hope I won't. I need to stop. You know.
I was going to say, actually, the book, I was interested in your writing style, actually, in the book, because it kind of appealed to. I would say it was written. Would you say it was written in more of a left brain style? And I was just interested as why you would intentionally articulate a message which is about moving more into the right brain, but something which it really appealed to my left brain somehow. Was that deliberate, or was that?
Oh, absolutely. Because what I realized is that there is a sort of dialogue of the deaf going on, where some people say, well, I think it's all important that everything should be explicit and, you know, rationalistically analyzed, and that's how we understand things. And then other people go, no, that's not right. We need to have this more intuitive, insightful understanding of what's implicit and so on. And it doesn't do any good to have a standoff. And this is a very personal thing, so just allow me to explain. I studied and taught English literature at Oxford before I trained in medicine. And I had a fascinating problem, which was I loved literature, but I was very troubled by a lot of the things people did when they approached it, because they took something that had to be implicit, had to be viewed as pretty much an embodied thing, not just a bunch of ideas, but something you experience, you know, when you read a poem or hear a piece of music, physical effects on you, not just an emotional, it's not just purely an intellectual thing. And it is quite unique. A good work of art, a great work of art is quite unique. It's not like anything else you could have imagined. And, you know, they took these things that were necessarily implicit. If you paraphrase them, they became banal, like trying to explain a joke. Necessarily unique and necessarily embodied, and talked about them in entirely disembodied general terms that made them fully explicit. Now, I realized that one of the things was that it's very difficult, obviously, to articulate things that need to be implicit. You really are onto a very difficult problem. And it was only when I started studying the brain and I realized that I went to a very important for me lecture, which was a life-changing experience by a colleague, Dr. John Cutting, who's one of the great living experts on hemisphere difference, devoted his life to studying it. And he was lecturing and pointing out, and I'd never heard this, that the right hemisphere is much better at understanding explicit meaning, is more in touch with the body, and understands uniqueness rather than just what, you know, category something falls into. And so I thought, oh my goodness me, the right hemisphere, which can't speak, is always trying to explain what it sees, which is the unique, the implicit, and the embodied. But the speech is in the left hemisphere, which is disembodied, abstract, and categorical. And so I really decided to devote the next 20 years to finding out more about this and write a book which explained, using all the analytic tools and, you know, in language, and I sweated blood over trying to do so, and the result was The Master and His Emissary. And that's why people have responded to it. I mean, I'm delighted to say that they have so much more than I could ever in my wildest dreams have believed. And often they write to me, one of the commonest things they say is, somehow at some level I understood all this, but I had no words to explain it, and now you've given me a way to understand it and explain it.
Yeah, it's almost like those aha moments. Thank you for sharing that. It's like those aha moments are. It's It's
Yes, yes.
when they're getting it on almost like a pre-conscious level, where it's like this as a felt experience, and sometimes your words have navigated them into that. I think through
Well,
metaphor, poetry, or you know.
what I tried to do was to be both empirically founded. So I spent a lot of time making sure I referenced the literature. There are over a couple of thousand references there, and there'll be another 5,000 in the book I've just finished writing. And which is why it was very important to me that there should be a proper bibliography demonstrating that I actually had done the hard work. I was a bit cross when they published the paperback and took the bibliography out. But anyway, the new edition, which came out earlier this year at my insistence and with their gracious compliance, now has the full bibliography in it again. And I wanted it to be rational so that people could follow it. A lot of people wrote to me saying, I was a very left hemisphere person, and then I read your book and at last I understood, and my marriage has got better, my work has got better, whatever, I'm enjoying life. Oh gosh, that's pretty. So if you like, what I wanted to do was to bring together, empirically based science that's rationally and analytically explained with poetry, because the other thing that impassions me is all the loveliness of nature, of art, of music, of poetry. And in the book, in some places, I do write in a way which people have considered more like poetry. In fact, one Irish poet took a page of my book and I just rewrote it on the page as a poem and sent it to me, which is really rather lovely.
It's almost like you are the corpus callosum of your own book.
That's a nice idea.
Well,
I like
because
that,
I guess you really nicely pace and led from the analytical side, and then moved it into like nice metaphors and talking about philosophy and poetry, and activate something that's almost wordless. I think that's really beautiful.
Well, good. Well, that's what I've tried to do in the more recent book as well.
I'm also wondering whether you talk about the history of which came first, like the sound, or I think you say music or speech.
Yes.
I'm just wondering whether this is maybe where we have the term spelling from, because these spells effectively are like magic spells, and these words can affect us in ways that it can affect our embodied experience just through words, because the left hemisphere is almost like a master of that.
Well, it is rather nice, and just to follow on from that, I don't know if you know that the word grammar actually comes from the root glamour, and glamour was originally a word for magic. So it was actually something that was part of casting spells, was something that was done by somebody who had the power to effect things with words. And that goes back to, as you know, there's a very long chapter in my book on how I believe that music was the origin of speech, and that language emerges from music, and that it still has the capacity, which we experience in poetry, of affecting us very directly at a metaphorical, embodied and implicit level. All kinds of things crowd in because we are able to see that actually words have power of themselves, because they ramify into so many different experiences that we've had. But we're so used in daily life, for reasons that make perfect sense. If you want to write a computer manual or something, then you really need to be very specific about how you use words. But in doing so, of course, you share them of all this magic, this spelling, this glamour, and they become tools. The difficulty then is that the left hemisphere goes, oh, well, a language is what I deal in, and it understands things in a rather abstract way. And so it thinks that language is a net of abstractions, which constructs theories about the world, rather than being a part of the world, being part of our embodied intercourse, if you like, with reality, with the world. And what interests me is that, as you say, I just quoted this chap who was himself a neurophysiologist in the 1830s in France, in Montpellier, Jacques Lourdes, who had written about a phasic stroke, the stroke in which you lose speech. And it was assumed that if you lost speech, you hadn't got the thoughts. And he said afterwards, because he made a recovery, and he wrote very strongly, I can no longer believe this, because although I couldn't find the words, the thoughts were very, very clear to me and ready to go, but I just couldn't get them into language. And then there's all the stuff about children and babies and how they prefer their native language, they prefer their mother's voice, they prefer stories that they've heard read in the womb in the last 6.5 weeks of gestation. Language is a very physical thing as well as a possibly very abstract tool.
It's funny, it might be that that's where we get the expression coming to terms with something, because we haven't quite got the word ready to to put forward, you know.
Yes, yes, that's right.
I don't want to go. This might sound really far out, but in a way, when I'm listening to you talk about the hemispheres, it's almost as if the left hemisphere is like a Newtonian mechanism, all about cause and effect, objects and things. And I feel like the right brain is like a parallel processor. It's a quantum. It activates the quantum field, if you like, where you're activating multiple dimensions simultaneously. And I think when you're in a play state, we learn quicker. We're like a sponge. We develop stronger relationships. We're like child. You know, I mentioned at the beginning, we're childlike. It's that's. But what's happened is we're taught in society to work for outcomes, to get that thing, get the job, get the girlfriend, get that six-figure physique. And I think that we've detached ourselves from our natural play state, which is actually our greatest learning mechanism, if you want to call it a mechanism. So I talk about that, and I coach people with that. And I just wanted to know if you had any thoughts about that. And one of the aspects of that is it's called art of social, and part of that is to see the social world like an artist, not an artisan. So an artisan crafts something together. They cobble something together based upon a very finite set of terms and conditions, or parameters, should we say. The artist is more about someone who's able to paint broad brushstrokes. They're not focused on what anyone else thinks. They're focused on their own self-expression. They don't know what the finished thing's going to look like until the end, but they're committed to the process rather than the outcome.
Yes. No, well, I would say a lot of things you've touched on there resonate, and I don't think that you're wrong to suppose that the left hemisphere sees more isolated objects, things, and goals, whereas the right hemisphere is more open to process and relationship. And you even made the Newtonian versus quantum comparison, which sounds very much like pop science and will cause certain kinds of scientists to get upset. But in fact, I've gone into this in some detail actually in the book I'm writing, and I have quite a number of following, in fact, among physicists who've written to me saying your book is extraordinarily resonant with things that we are finding in physics. And so I run what I have to say about physics past, a group of physicists, and they don't all throw their hands up in horror when I say things not dissimilar from what you're saying. Of course, one has to be careful about exactly what one's saying, and it's a very difficult area to talk about, so I don't want anyone to jump to any conclusions, but there we are. But what, interestingly, the title of the book I'm now writing, at least I'm hoping that this will be okay with Penguin Random House, who are publishing it, is The Matter with Things. And that's a pun on several levels about our obsession with matter, as though it's something we understand when we actually don't, and things as being the primary stuff, and that what we do in understanding the world is put things together. Now, I actually would turn all these things on their head and say that actually things emerge out of a network of relationships. So the network of relationships is primary to what we then call things, which are like nodes in this net that look solid and attract our attention for a while. But although this is a difficult thing to put across and sounds very paradoxical, I hold that relations are prior to relata to the things that are related. And indeed, there is a physicist, David Merman, who states this as a physical fact. And that's quite contrary to the way we think. We think that there's a lot of inert objects, and we make sense of the world by putting them together. In fact, we've already started to lose the sense of things when we prioritize things and targeted goals and isolated elements from a much richer whole, which is never fixed, never certain, but never completely unknown. Our lives are, in fact, one long journey of knowing more, which is complicated by the fact that the more we think we certainly know something, the less we actually know it. So that the progress into knowledge is also one of realizing how little we really know. Sorry, that will sound all very paradoxical.
It doesn't sound paradoxical to me, because actually, I as soon as you were saying that, I was seeing like on a pool table, balls bashing into each other for the objects and things, and I was imagining maybe a ball of wool, or maybe something even more interconnected than that, as you were talking about that, in terms of like the interconnected relationship that we all have. But the guys that, let's say, that I'm working with, that one of the major things that comes up for them when in terms of socializing and creating social connections is that they've almost developed a lexicon, a language around socializing. So they often refer to a woman as the object, and I have to approach the object. It almost sounds like objects and things, and it's almost like I have to avoid rejection. In other words, avoid losing. I have to grasp that thing, and if I don't grasp that thing, I've lost. And what happens is it creates a binary outcome system of winning and losing, winning and losing, winning and losing.
Absolutely.
Whereas the place that I'm trying to move them to is, if you're in a state of play and you're expressing yourself with people, you actually you collapse the winning and losing. It's almost like you enter I call it the quantum self, but you remove the winning and losing aspect, because you're always winning. You're kind of always you're embracing a different dimension, which is just about enjoyment, fulfillment. Through the process.
Well, I love that, and would agree with it. A philosopher called Carse, C-A-R-S-E, wrote a book called Finite and Infinite Games. And essentially, the idea is quite simple, that there are games that are finite, which are played in order to achieve a certain goal. And when it's achieved, that's the end of the game. And there are infinite games that are played for the sake of playing the game. And they effectively can go on for as long as you like, because they are fulfilled by the playing, not by the outcome. And that is a lovely distinction, because it applies to so many things in life, and all the richest things are infinite games. They're not finite games. Our relationships, our loves, but also everything that we enter into and put our heart and soul into, including science and philosophy, are not to achieve a specific end, really. They're for the sake of deepening the process. And it's all about processes, not about things. And if we could get that into our heads, it would be wonderful. Yeah. My favorite philosopher, Heraclitus, who I still think was the greatest Western philosopher anyway that ever lived, his favorite, not favorite, but his best known saying, which paradoxically he may never have said, is all things flow. And in other words, that things are not things, they are processes. And this actually is true about ourselves, our bodies, the cells in our bodies. Everything is a process. Even the mountain behind my house is a process. It's a wave that if you had a time-lapse camera going back into history, you would see about to collapse on my house. I haven't told my insurance company, but it's just moving very, very slowly. So slowly that it's moving only a particle of a millimeter every year. But it's moving, and everything is a process. The hardest, most solid things we know are not solid, they are processes.
Absolutely, yeah. They're events. That even the table that I'm sitting on was once
an event.
It's an event. Everything's an event. So everything is in flux. But the left brain can't handle that, because it wants to know everything. It wants to have a grip of everything, and
well, it wants certainty, and it wants to grasp things, and it wants to control them. And if it can't, it gets paranoid.
What happens? Okay, and so. What does it do once it gets paranoid? What does the left brain throw up into the nervous system? Let's say when it doesn't have control. What's the default mechanism there?
Well, what happens is that I mean, if you wanted to talk in such terms, that the left amygdala becomes overexcitable, and it needs to be calmed down by the left frontal cortex. One of the ways in which we do this is to give people things like CBT, because cognitive behavioral therapy, what this is basically do is engaging the left brain in quietening down its own anxiety about not being in control of everything. Because lots of patients, I can say, as you know, having spent decades as a psychiatrist, you could say that lots of patients' main problem is that they feel they're not in control. And I'm very tempted to say to them, well, join the club, because there's almost nothing that any of us is in control of at all. And as soon as you realize that, you can start enjoying life and surfing the waves rather than trying like Canute to make the wave. Well, actually, Canute never did try to make the waves, but you know what I mean, recede. So it's this desire for control that is so damaging. And Oriental philosophy is very good on this, because it says that you can't control, and the more you try, you just frustrate yourself.
Absolutely. I actually, it's like the sailor that rides the seas rather than try and control the waves, isn't it? It's the
absolutely.
You have a rough idea where you want to go. You have an intention, but you're not trying to control each wave and really force it. You're happy to glide along with the currents and flow with it.
Absolutely. And any great sports person who is in the groove, or any great performer, or any great musician is in the groove, in the sense that they're not trying to control it. The thing is coming through them. And one of the most exotic of these is TT racers, on the Isle of Man, the people who ride motorbikes up to 200 miles an hour on ordinary roads. Apparently, if they think about where they are or take in any details of where they are, they come off the bike. So they have to be in this special zone where they're thinking about where the road is up to 1.5 miles ahead. And then they ride the event that is the road.
There's a term that's actually used in terms. It's like a it's a basketball term, and it's like a full court awareness. It's something like that. It's where you can almost even it's like a sixth sense, where you kind of know where everyone's going, where everyone is, without actually kind of a focused myopic awareness. And they refer to that as almost like a phenomenon where you kind of like you have, and they call it the ultimate flow state in sport. They often refer to that as. And I can see that. And talking about in the groove, let's say, and I had this when I learned a musical instrument. I went through this process where my right brain was really engaged. It had this imagination. It was really the sense of wanting to play and be this artist with the instrument. But then what happened is when I was learning the violin, I kind of had to learn each string independently. And
absolutely.
And I had to go into a very workman-like state with that. And I kind of got stuck, and I got very frustrated, and I got very resentful over this instrument that was once this thing that symbolized this music and art and poetry, and it became this goddamn thing that I couldn't solve, like a Rubik's cube. And I almost felt like putting it away, because I didn't want to go through that. It's almost like a left brain process of like seeing everything as strings that I have to pluck, rather than. So what I did is to go into just feel what it's like to just play and let go, and be and
well, absolutely. And you've made a very, very beautiful point, because you wouldn't be a good musician if you hadn't done all that taking it of it apart and painfully practicing your fingering and all the rest. Because you need that as well. It's just that mustn't be where you end up. As you rightly said, you got frustrated feeling that's where you'd ended. But it was an intermediary step. And this is always the case. The right hemisphere grounds the traction, the idea, the whole. The left hemisphere then has to do a lot of little fiddly stuff, but it needs to do that. But when you come back to the piece of music, you must forget all about, all that you learned there. But it's not really lost. It's been internalized and is now part of you. So that's what should always happen. Go from the right to the left and back to the right. But the trouble is that in our society now, things go from the right into the left, which analyzes it, compartmentalizes it, categorizes it, administrates it, bureaucratizes it, and then that's the end of the story. And then life is lost in this process, because life is absolutely inimical to this process.
We've forgotten to do that final stage, which is to bring it all the way back round and integrate it into play.
Exactly.
That's the missing stage, isn't it? That's the missing stage. It's okay
very, very badly missing.
It's okay to give the left brain and say, can you make sense of that and categorize that and make some nice words around that?
Absolutely.
So we can, but please don't keep hold of it. Give it back to us and let us play.
Well, another way of thinking of this is that although I loathe the idea that the brain is a computer, because it's nothing like a computer, actually, it is true that the left hemisphere is a bit like having a very smart personal computer. In other words, you understand a problem. You then want something to do a lot of manipulation of data very fast that you can't do and you don't want to do and all the rest. So you get the computer to do that, but then it spews something out. And if that just remains on the desk, it doesn't mean anything. It has to be taken back by you into life and applied to what you already knew. Now, that is how it should work. But if you ask the left hemisphere to understand it, it can't understand it any more than the computer understands the stuff it's just been doing. And that's the problem, is we now have gone from an understanding of the world to putting everything into terms of a bureaucratic, legalistic nature, and thinking now we understand them. Well, that's the last place at which you understand them. They then, all that work having been usefully, valuably done, it has to be reintegrated into the whole.
Reintegrated, and that reintegration into the whole, is it not, would I say, it's a simplification process, it's a distilling process. So the left
whether it's a simplification, I wouldn't say that. No, but I would say it's a sophistication or embrace, actually, of it. So that in a way it takes back into itself all. So what it knew anyway and knows, and the new information. And it's rather like the unfolding of a flower. So there's a tightness of the bud, and you want to see the flower, you want to see it unfolded. And when it's unfolded, then it's the whole flower as a whole, but it's not the petal plus the stamen plus the calyx plus the stem plus it's that's when you've lost it. Yes.
If we were to learn, let's say driving a car, there's multiple different tasks that you have to do simultaneously. But once you reach a certain level of just competence, let's say, you're just driving.
Yeah.
You know? But if we're trying to think of those 100 different things that we learned in our driving lessons, we'd actually crash. So that's what I meant by simplifying it down into just an unconscious knowing and unconscious.
Yes. In that sense, and it's very much what a very experienced surgeon or pilot does. They have to learn an enormous amount, and then once they're a good surgeon or pilot, they don't think about it; they do it.
Absolutely, yeah. And this is the thing. So the guys there's a whole language around socializing that I'm aware of in terms of the industry I'm in. And I actually think that these constructs are actually constricting people because they get stuck in the terms and not in the betweenness that you've referred to, between the relationships. And they've actually created words between words and between words, and there's so many words that infer their action to talking that they become paralyzed. What I try and get them to do is I lead them. I actually use language to lead them out of it. I pace and lead them on the language, but it's like semantic engineering. I use language to lead them into more simplistic and embodied language, and then at the very last point is to do away with the language. In other words, integrate the language, the simplified language, and then just come from essence, come from expression, come from intention, come from curiosity, come from feeling. And then at that point, the whole language you don't need it anymore. But these people, they're stuck on the words,
Yeah. No, well, that's obviously a very good work that you do there.
Thank you. But it's brilliant to have you on and get so much reinforcement to the work that I'm doing, but also great insights you've researched into the book. I mean, it's an absolute compendium of information. I don't know how long. I think I heard you spent 10 years writing it or something like that. But
no, 20.
Oh, 20 years of your life. And I just want to say for people.
But I was trying to do a very busy job at the same time. It's taken me about 10 years to write the current book, but then I've been mainly writing for 10 years.
Okay, well, I'm sure I'll give it another 10 years and we may
no more. After this, will be no more. No more big ones anyway. No more big books.
Okay,
just little books.
So would you like to mention your book just so we can have this, in right at the end now, and just where they can find your book and also your other services and talks, if you like, or your website.
Yes. Well, I have a website, which is iainmcgilchrist.com, which is fairly straightforward, or iainmcgilchrist.co.uk. You have to spell my name reasonably right, but actually if you put it into Google search engine and get it wrong, it will direct you anyway. The book itself is, or the book we've been talking about anyway, is The Master and His Emissary, The Divided Brain and the Making of the Western World, which is published by Yale University Press and available either online or from a bookseller. And I have quite a lot of exposure on YouTube, talks, podcasts, interviews, lectures, and I'm just beginning a channel. It's not up and running yet, but I hope in the next couple of months will be up and running, which will be a private channel on which people can send me questions that they want me to talk about, and hear material that won't be so widely available. And I'm also finishing a book which I hope will be called The Matter with Things, which will come out in about a year's time from Penguin Random House, which is my up-to-date thinking of the last 10 years.
Iain McGilchrist, thank you so much for coming on. We really appreciate it, and I'm sure everyone that's watching has got an absolute wealth of information from that.
It's been a pleasure, John.